Hello and welcome to Lesson 4. We'll be looking at the political violence between 1919 and 1923, and particularly, again as always, focusing less on what happened, but more on how does this affect support for Weimar democracy and how does this affect Weimar democracy. So, the story of political violence is essentially that there are three major sources of it. There's the left-wing political violence, the right-wing political violence, and then, although it's not quite violence, there's also the right-wing elites who will cause a lot of problems and help a lot of the right-wing violence to happen. So, you could argue, in this period, because democracy is relatively new, and because democracy is relatively weak, and everyone sees it as weak, many people will attempt revolutions or putsches. Putsches is the word for coup attempts. In German, that means basically trying to take over the government. Many people on the left and right will attempt these revolutions and putsches because they see the government as weak. If you know that your revolution is going to fail, you're not going to do it. But if you think there might be a chance of success, you'll give it a go. None of these will be directly successful. None of these will change Germany, and none of these will take over the government for longer than 4 days. However, the violence will cause vast amounts of lasting political damage to the Weimar democracy, because many Germans will have their image of democracy, which was relatively positive, if you remember last lesson in 1919, destroyed, and it's associated with chaos. Because under the Kaiser there wasn't shooting on the street, there wasn't communist uprising, there wasn't right-wing violence. And so what this sense of, but under democracy what happens is there's suddenly fighting on the streets, death, assassinations, killing, chaos. And it's not hard for many middle-class people to listen to the propaganda and hear the idea that actually democracy leads to chaos. And therefore what that means is many people will in turn then side with right-wing parties and support anti-democratic ideals. So what political violence does is it gives this image of like society does not work under democracy, and makes many people increasingly think, okay, if society doesn't work, we need to go back to dictatorship, which naturally means that they will support the extreme right-wing parties. As well as this, the violence, as we shall see, is self-reinforcing. What this means is, when the right wing does some violence, the left wing responds. Therefore, when the left wing responds, the right wing does some violence back. Both sides are paranoid of the other, and so will use force because they feel threatened by the other. And every time one side does something, that would only heighten their sense of the other side's sense of threat and means they want to fight back. As we shall see as well, the elites will only make the violence worse by encouraging it through siding with the right-wing extremists and helping them when they go to court, and helping them by giving them weapons and protection. So we're going to divide this session up. It's been quite a long one. We're going to session up into 3 sections. We're going to look at left-wing violence, right-wing violence, and then right-wing elites. So to start with, threats from the left. And obviously, if people are not quite sure, left-wing essentially means people who are communist or socialist. Communism very argues that there needs to be an end to capitalism. Capitalism needs to be finished because it's inherently unfair and keeps power in the hands of the rich and keeps money in the hands of the rich, and instead needs to be distributed equally to the poor. And the only way you do that is that you have a revolution where you destroy the power of the rich. If you do what happened in the Russian Revolution, you line up many of the rich and you shoot them. Those who don't get shot, you just take their stuff. And then you make a people's socialist republic. So there are a number of left-wing revolutions and attempted revolutions. To give only a few, there's one in Bavaria that we're going to look at in a lot of detail, one in the Ruhr, which is a very industrial region, a couple in Berlin, and then one in Saxony. Now in reality, the left-wing never really had a chance to succeed. So their threat was never really about how well or how much they they could take over. They were always poorly organised. They always generally didn't do very well in making sure that everyone was in the right place at the right time. This is in part because many communist groups don't believe in having leaders, or at least don't believe in having strict leaders. And what that means is that if you don't have anyone in charge, but just lots of smaller groups of like cells, almost smaller groups based around factories or areas, people won't necessarily do everything right at the same time, which means you can be picked off one by one. They were poorly armed because they didn't really have access to weapons, which meant that they often, when they were fighting the right, who were soldiers armed with proper guns, they were often outclassed. And in some cases, particularly when they were revolted in areas which were less revolutionary, like Bavaria and Saxony, they didn't really have a lot of support. People liked the ideas, but not enough to die for, so they didn't really help them. So then you would have a situation where many people will be sympathetic. Oh, I like the idea of left-wing revolution, but I'm not going to fight the Freikorps for it. And so what happens is they are very often outnumbered. And the biggest thing is that they were opposed by the military and the Freikorps, who were trained, experienced, had large numbers, and very, very well armed. And therefore, I should say government-backed troops there. And therefore, they were always outclassed in the battlefields. So we'll look at two examples. You don't need to worry too much about these examples, but they are good in case you need to drop them into an essay. The first one is Berlin. On the 1st of January 1919, the Spartacus Union, these people become the KPD, or the communists, agreed that they would try and do an uprising in Berlin. As always, the uprising was poorly organised, poorly planned. People didn't really know where to go. The weapons weren't in the right place. They didn't have many weapons. Most people didn't actually know how to fight a battle or fight a war, because many of the communists had stayed at home during World War I. And therefore it was easily crushed by the army. The two leaders, probably the best two communist leaders that the communists ever had, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, were murdered by the Freikorps after surrendering. Ebert not only sent the troops in and turned a blind eye and accepted their mass killings afterwards, he then used Article 48 afterwards to legalise all the extrajudicial, that means outside of courts, executions of the Freikorps. And we're going to look at an example of one in a second. The government, essentially, therefore, was using the right-wing anti-democratic forces to keep democracy alive. They were using the army, who hated democracy, and the Freikorps, who were hating democracy, to fight the communists. Now, this is a problem, because obviously the Freikorps and the army were happy to use violence now because they're fighting communists, but doesn't necessarily mean they actually care or listen about the democracy, or will listen to what Ebert says in future. And furthermore, as we shall see, this will cause massive problems, because many left-wingers, even people in Ebert's own party, will see the fact that Ebert is sending in the right-wing authoritarian army to kill fellow left-wingers, even if they're KPD, they're fellow left-wingers, and kill them in the streets. And not only that, legalise their killing even if there's no reason for it. And this will mean that many SPD supporters will go over to the side of the KPD and lose the SPD support. Now, as always, because it's a proportional representation system, that's even worse than it would be normally, because that means there's fewer people in the Reichstag left. If you lose 20% of your vote, for example, that means you have 20% fewer deputies in the Reichstag. What that means is, in turn, that it's harder to form a coalition to run the country. That means that coalitions are weaker, because then they always break so much easier. Okay, so the second one is Red Bavaria. Now, we did this one in class, so I won't do it too much detail, but there's another example, and this is the most successful one, when in February 1919, the USPD, who don't need to worry too much, that's the Independent Socialist Democratic Party, who will eventually join the Communists, triggered a revolution in Bavaria, and in May it was crushed by the Freikorps. But again, this is another example of how Ebert uses Article 48 to send in soldiers, and then retrospectively, that means after the fact, say that all the bad things that they did, all the executions of people who had surrendered, all the killings of wounded people in the street who caused no harm, that was all legal. So, what were the consequences of the revolution left? In reality, there's no chance of a communist revolution. So we can't say that that was its threat. The left wing's threat wasn't the fact that it could take over. Because of all the reasons mentioned before, they didn't really have a chance. But what it does do is it keeps people in Germany terrified of the communist revolution. Many people in the middle classes were scared of a communist revolution anyway, even if there hadn't been one. But as soon as you see this constantly, week after week, month after month, more and more communist revolutions, you are going to get more and more scared of a communist revolution. You think it's going to happen, more and more likely to happen. You're more and more likely to believe it will happen. And what this leads to is three major effects. Because people are scared of communists, they're more likely to support the violence of the right, because they say at least these guys are killing communists. I don't necessarily like people murdering each other, but I prefer the fact they're killing communists because communists I'm scared of. By the way, if you're not sure why middle class people and upper class people will be scared of communists, if communists take the rich's stuff to give to the poor, if you're middle class, you will probably lose out in that. And many middle class people in Russia in 1917 during the revolution found themselves killed or kicked out of the country, or at least at the very least lost all their stuff. It also made them more willing to listen to right-wing parties whenever they said anti-communist things. The people were scared of communists, so if you want to get their support, you'd be like Hitler and you promise to deal with communists. So it gives another issue for right-wing parties to get support from German people. And as well as that, because people were so scared of communism, the fact that the Weimar democracy and the parties of the government, the SPD, the DDP and the Z, could not stop this from happening, meant that many people assumed that the government and these parties were weak. If there wasn't a threat from communists, people would feel less worried. And if you're worried, then you are more likely to blame people. So that last one again. Many people felt that under the Kaiser there was none of this socialist revolution stuff, none of this communist stuff. But now we have a democracy, it's all gone up, and there's all this fighting, there's killing, and all this sort of stuff. What this leads it to is many people go, okay, under democracy, under weak Democrats such as the SPD, the DDP and Centre Party, we have communists taking over. So if we want to stop this, we need to go back to how it was, far more authoritarian, far more strict and far more right-wing. As well as this, and this is a more AA style point, but it's really worth noting, Ebert has sent in right-wing forces to brutally murder and kill outside of the rules of war, communists. And not only that, he then used Article 48 to make all that killing legal. This means that many SPD people and many on the left feel like they have been betrayed by Ebert. Ebert has sided the right, he's been corrupted. Okay, and what this means is that many SPD supporters will join the communists rather than stay with the SPD. Obviously, if the SPD, as mentioned, loses 20% of its members to the KPD, it has 20% fewer members in the Reichstag. If your coalition is only governing by 5%, that means you don't have that majority anymore. That means it's impossible to run the country. That means there's political problems. That means that therefore there's political chaos. As well as this will lead to a massive divide between the SPD and the KPD. And both parties will spend as much time fighting each other all the way up to 1933 when Hitler comes to power than fighting the Nazis. And even when Hitler is taking them out, he's arresting them, he's creating a police state, he's creating a terrorist state. And the only way to fight this would be to work together to make a revolution against Hitler. They still refuse to work together because they still hated each other, particularly communists hated the SPD, because of what Ebert did against the violence of revolution left. And you can argue, without the left-wing violence, Ebert wouldn't have had to do that, and therefore we wouldn't have this problem. What this all means then, Hitler's job of taking over the country and making a dictatorship was so much easier because his enemies were divided. So, the second area of threat was from the right. So the left believe in communism, the right believe in some sort of dictatorship. Now actually the right wing never really fully agreed. Do they want the Kaiser back? Do they want a military-backed government? Do they want a different system of dictatorship? But what they all agreed on is that they hated communists and they hated democracy. So what right-wing violence will do is a little bit more complex. But they will, much like the left, try a lot of revolutions, or in their cases, putsches. A putsch is another word for a coup, which is another word for when people try and take out the government. Usually the army helps try and take out the government and take over. Once again, none of these will succeed, but these usually came much closer to succeeding. What left-wing and right-wing violence both does is, because you have violence, because you have chaos, because you have people dying on the street, this adds to an atmosphere of chaos. As mentioned with the left-wing violence, this didn't happen under the Kaiser. It means, therefore, that many people who were naturally pro-democratic, they see the shooting on the street because the right-wingers see the shooting on the street, and left-wingers and think both sides are to blame, but like, this didn't happen under democracy, therefore we need to go back to the good old days. With the right-wing violence, it would also cause a split in the left, as we've already mentioned, with the Freikorps executions of communist members. And finally, a particular special one that people often forget is that the assassination attempts and assassination campaigns of the right wing will mean that some of the most capable, most skilled politicians will be executed. And if you lose your most able politicians, your government is usually weaker. So, a couple of things. The Freikorps are key at this point. The Freikorps, or Freikorps, is a rough label for about 200 paramilitary groups. Paramilitary means they are linked to the military, they're friends of the military, they work with the military, but officially they are not part of the military. Now, most of them are ex-soldiers and officers who didn't have a job, and actually it's quite helpful to get paid for this. Most of them also joined because they hated communists and were very, very nationalist. That means they liked the idea of a strong central country. What's important to realise about the Freikorps is that they exist because of the army. If the army didn't like them, they could easily get rid of them. But the army liked having a paramilitary group, because the army likes to see itself as above politics. It wants to see itself as above dealing with grubby little murders, etc. But at the same time, it quite liked the idea of destabilising government and killing communists. So if you have the Freikorps, they can do the dirty jobs such as executing people. For example, this picture here, executing a young communist. And therefore they'll get their stuff done. But at the same time, the army doesn't look like it's got involved. They can always blame the Freikorps for it. They're the proper ones who do the fighting. It's the Freikorps who are a little bit chaotic. So the Freikorps see themselves as the people who would fight the Bolsheviks, that's another word for communists, in Germany, and they saw themselves as the beginning of the new German army. And they would constantly, whenever there was left-wing risings, fight the communists and sometimes socialists, and always win. They were always well organised, well, because they're ex-soldiers and ex-officers, well armed because the army gave them a lot of equipment. If you have a look at those Freikorps, they're armed in German army uniforms. And they were very similar to other groups such as fascist squads in Italy. And as we shall see, and you haven't met these guys yet, but you will when we start on Hitler, many will join Hitler's SA or stormtroopers afterwards, particularly when the Freikorps wind down. So there are a couple of examples of when right-wing groups, including some Freikorps units, remember there are lots of different units, it's a group name rather than they're all one big group, where they try and take over. And the big one is the Kapp-Putsch, or the Kapp-Luttwitz Putsch, but you can call it the Kapp-Putsch. Essentially, Wolfgang Kapp was the leader of the Kapp Patriotic Party and a journalist, and Luttwitz was the leader of one of the Freikorps units. And the government basically told the Freikorps units to disband and to quit. And what happens instead is Luttwitz and Kapp instead decide to ignore this and march on Berlin to take over. As they march on Berlin, what happens is the army is told to go out and stop the Freikorps, but the army say they won't. The army say they refuse to shoot upon their own army, or they say Reichswehr does not shoot on Reichswehr. Reichswehr is the name for army. Reichswehr is spelled R-E-I-C-H, same word, W-E-H-R, Reichswehr. And therefore, suddenly you've got all these armed men marching towards you, but no way to defend yourself. So what has to happen is the government has to flee and has to leave Berlin. What happens is the government under Ebert has fled. This destroys their authority and makes them look very weak. And then Kapp takes over and is declared Chancellor of Germany. The only thing Ebert could do, he can't use military force anymore because the army refused to shoot, is he called a general strike. A general strike is where everyone goes and strike. From buses to shops to schools to police, everything goes on strike. And what happens is after 4 days of general strike, Kapp and Luttwitz, but let's take Kapp for now, they end up having to decide: do you shoot workers on the street to make them go back to work, or do you give in? And it becomes quite clear that the army won't want to be associated with anyone who shoots workers in the street for no reason, and so they decide to give in and flee. Now, what happens is, as a result of this, is actually this has massive effects on democracy. It shows a massive weakness in democracy, and shows that that democracy is very weak at looking after the interests of the people. And it also destroys the authority that Ebert has. If watching the president and the chancellor have to flee from a relatively small group of soldiers shows that it is not in control, makes it look incredibly weak. Something that people will not long forget. As well as this, many SPD supporters start to believe that sort of the democratic government won't work, and actually what needs to happen is revolution. So many SPD supporters go over to the KPD. Again, all that sort of stuff we mentioned before about how this leads to the political chaos and things being hard to rule. And as well as this, all it does is keep on adding to this image that under democracy, Germany doesn't work. Democracy leads to chaos. Democracy leads to bad things happening. Under the Kaiser, did this not happen? What we need to do, therefore, is go back to the good old days. Okay. In terms of what's the only real point of context about the Kapp-Putsch is essentially this shows that the army is politicised. It only cares on one side, and that massively shows about how the government's survival is only dependent on the most unreliable forces. If it entirely relies on the power of the army or the general strike, both of whom are, if you think about the general strike, was organised a lot by the communists, both of which rely on people who basically hate democracy, and suggest that the government is very weak. The other thing that happens, particularly after 1920, is that many people on the right start to suspect that democracy is funded by the communists. This is because the communists had done a big job in the general strike. They had organised a lot of the strikes, they had organised a lot of the workers. And the fact that Ebert had to ask the communists to help him in the general strike meant many people felt like actually the government was influenced or dependent on communists, which is obviously very bad. So what they decided to do is join a secret organisation aimed to destroy the power of communism and intimidate the powers of government. The most dangerous of these was called the Consul Organisation. Yet people on the left did some assassinations, but the vast majority of assassinations and murders were on the right. Okay, as you see there, 354 of the 376 murders were carried out by right-wing organisations. Now these assassinations hit some of the most powerful, most important people in Weimar. Erzberger, who is a Centre Party leader, Geris, who is a USPD leader, were murdered, as well as Rafenau, who's a DDP leader. Now, the political effects of each of these. Geris was a person who ran the USPD. The USPD was halfway between communism and the SPD. Geris was the only person skilled enough to manage to keep this party together. After he was executed, the party went fairly radical, and they all joined the communists, which massively increased the size of the communists and meant that therefore you have more anti-democratic, more anti-Weimar forces in democracy. Erzberger was probably the most talented politician, not because he knew how to run the country, but he was very good at forming coalitions. Now, in a coalition-based system, in a system of proportional representation, if you have someone who's very good at keeping groups of people together, groups of different people from different groups together, that is a massive help. And by killing Erzberger, you get rid of one of the few people who could have perhaps made Weimar democracy work and become increasingly stable. So again, that leads to political problems down the line. Rafenau as well is killed. So this has two major effects, as mentioned. By killing people who are the most able politicians, the best politicians who can run well, who can keep the coalitions together, what happens is you are left with less skilled politicians who are not so good at coalitions, not so good at keeping people happy, and therefore governments which fall the whole time, governments which don't work, and governments which don't do anything. And therefore that makes democracy less popular and weaker. As well as this, if you're in a country where the top politicians are being killed on a weekly basis without seemingly any repercussions, without any punishments, that gives you a sense of this country's not being run well. This country's being run badly. And as you mentioned before, that idea then means many Germans then go, logically, what we need now is dictatorship and back to the good old days. So, and finally, the last group which contributes to the sense of chaos and violence in the Weimar Republic are the elites. Now these guys, if you don't remember from last lesson or lesson before, elites are the people who are at the top of society, the judiciary, the judges, the army, the civil service, the industrialists, and the landowners. Now these people will very, very rarely get involved in the violence themselves. But what they do is they are unnecessarily biased and one-sided to the right wing, and therefore encourage and help right-wing violence to happen, therefore adding to all the bad effects we just mentioned. So when we talk about elites, we really want to make clear that they enable and encourage the chaos rather than do it themselves. So the first one is the judiciary. Judiciary means judges. Article 54 of the Constitution said that judges had to be independent. They couldn't be told what to do and they couldn't be changed, which meant that the vast majority of judges were people who had been put there by the Kaiser, and therefore people who were right-wing, usually anti-democratic, and very conservative. And so very often they argued, and they always showed bias against the Republic, and were always helpful to those who wanted to destroy democracy so long as they were right-wing. Okay, so for example, of the 22 political murders, 10 were sentenced to death. Of the 356 right-wing murders, none will be sentenced to death. And another example, of the 704 top people involved in the Kapp-Putsch, only one would serve prison time, and therefore, it was a couple of years, and he was out after 2. And Hitler, after his putsch in 1923, was given the lightest sentence he could possibly do. He had been guilty of murdering, leading a march which murdered 4 police officers. He was responsible for an act of treason to take over the government and robbing a bank. And he got less than 5 years in a really comfortable prison, and he served about half of that. So what the judges are doing here is they are basically encouraging right-wing violence. Because if you know you aren't going to get punished at all, if any, and if you are going to get punished very lightly, you're not going to get punished for essentially killing people and taking over the government, you are more likely to do it. And additionally, you can also point out that many people on the left, many SPD people, saw this blatantly unfair system, saw the fact that the government weren't doing anything about it under Ebert, and decided perhaps it's time to go to the communists, because at least the communists might do something. And it leads to many SPD people again going over to the communists, angering the working classes, and that leads to all sorts of problems of, like, you now have fewer people to in your coalition to run the country, because all those seats which would have gone to SPD men now are KPD people who refuse to vote for you. So in a good example, we've looked at other examples, and we're going to look at Hitler's example in far more detail. Is comparing what happens to Felix Fechenbach, who was someone who printed something relatively seditious. What that means is he encouraged people to perhaps revolt and join the Bavarian, make a Bavarian revolution. He was given 11 years. Yet in the same area, Bavaria, Hitler was given only 5 years for actually killing policemen, trying to physically take on the government rather than actually saying things and robbing a bank. He only served, actually that's incorrect, served over 9 months, only just under half. Okay, so that is the judiciary. The big thing there, therefore, it emboldens, encourages the right, and it angers and alienates the left, makes upset. Now the army. Now the army was weird because at the very start, and pretty much on the second day of the new democracy, Ebert and the head of the army had something called the Ebert-Groener Agreement. Okay, the Ebert-Groener Agreement essentially said that what will happen in return for us doing absolutely nothing to you, we promise not to change you the army, we promise not to change your officers, we let you run yourself, we won't get involved. In return for that, you got to promise to try and help us if there's revolution and not trying to directly destroy us. That is the deal. So let's get the president is saying to the army, if you don't try and destroy us and you help us, I will not try and change you at all. I'll let you keep all your officers. I won't try and change you. I won't try and have any control over you. You will stay independent. In the short term, this is good, because if Ebert hadn't done this and had tried to change all the army, there's a good chance the army would have revolted and easily would have won and taken over the government and destroyed democracy. In the long term, though, this deal is bad, purely because this means that the army keep their position at the top of society, and to a lesser extent the judges and civil servants and all the others keep their position at the top of society, which they will use that position to constantly harm democracy and undermine democracy. So what the Ebert-Groener Agreement does is, while it means that the army has no reason to revolt, it also means that they are basically exactly the same as they were under the Kaiser, but even more independent. And therefore they can do whatever they want. And as we shall see, and as you have already seen, they will do whatever they want. For example, then no one got punished in the army, apart from the person at the very, very top, for refusing to help the Republic when Kapp and his Putsch came up. So, the army was used by Ebert to crush the left. Okay, he used Article 48, sends the army in, and they loved it. They were really good. They happily killed many a communist. Because they were right wing and they obviously hated them. They also protected the Freikorps and armed the Freikorps and trained the Freikorps. And they stopped the government from really disbanding them in any meaningful way, because the Freikorps were like the attack dog of the army. As I mentioned, the army liked the idea of its being above politics. It didn't like itself getting its hands dirty. But at the same time, it also liked the idea of destroying communists. By having the Freikorps, they could walk into a place and do all the proper army things, but then they could also send in the Freikorps to the working class areas to terrify and terrorize and execute whoever they want. And then if anyone blames the army for this, they can say, well, no, it wasn't us, it was the Freikorps. So it gives deniability to the actions, but they really liked it. The army as well also gave weapons and harbored the assassins of the Consul Organization. Many assassins of the Consul Organizations were soldiers in the army, and as well as that, the Freikorps units were mostly armed by the army. And both these things, without the army, you can argue the assassinations and the right-wing violence would not have happened. Hitler was in fact armed in parts by the army as well, and in his Munich Putsch in 1923. So although the army isn't directly rebelling, by giving guns and safety to people who are, you are encouraging more rebellions. And as well as already mentioned, they are clearly playing politics in this period by refusing to defend the Republic against right-wing threats. As mentioned, in 1923, the army under General von Seeckt refused to send troops to deal with the Munich Putsch. Okay, he did not want to use his army to attack people on the nationalist right. Now, in reality, the police were enough to do it. But again, it showed the fact that the army of both Bavaria and the Central Army refused to deal with the violence of the right shows that they are ultimately anti-democratic and they are hurting democracy. There's only a chance that the police officers could deal with the NSDAP Munich Putsch because they were so bad, and there's only a chance that this general strike had beaten the Kapp-Putsch. So they are clearly hurting democracy by refusing to defend it from right-wing threats. So, overall, there are several major effects of violence. First things first, the violence on the left or right served to perpetuate, that means keep going violence. Because once the left is violent, that provokes the right wing to be violent, which in turn provokes the left wing to be violent. So you can argue that left wing or right wing violence creates a circle of violence which only gets worse and worse. The fact that the government couldn't control the violence, the fact that under the Kaiser there wasn't violence but under the democracy there's loads, destroys its authority and adds to this image that many Germans have, and many right-wingers argue, that democracy is weak and cannot keep people safe. And if you're a middle-class person or if you're even a working class person and you value your safety, you don't want to be shot in the street, this makes you very question whether democracy is a good thing. Because ultimately you like the idea of democracy, but you prefer not to be shot in the street. And if there's a choice between having a dictatorship and being safe, or having a democracy and being shot in the street, most people will go for the dictatorship. So this means that many people start listening to ideas that are right, about who argue that what Germany needs is dictatorship, a strong government, an authoritarian government, which means it's quite strict, and a government which can protect the people. So that's number one. That adds a sense of chaos, which means that people go on. Number two, it also leads to the left wing becoming divided, because when Ebert, the head of the SPD, sends in right-wing army officers to brutally kill KPD revolutionaries, the KPD refuse to forgive them, which means they will never work for the SPD, even when it's in both their interests to do it. As well as that, many SPD people will be disgusted at Ebert's actions of siding with the army, and they will join the KPD. This will make the SPD weaker. And again, going back to the idea of proportional representation, the governments barely have a majority. If you have SPD, Centre Party, DDP, they don't really have a very strong majority in the Reichstag. If you suddenly lose loads more deputies because people have voted for the KPD instead of the SPD, then those coalitions only get smaller and harder to manage, and therefore that leads to more political chaos because more governments fall. Okay, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And finally, what violence, particularly assassinations, do is it removes the most capable politicians from the Weimar Republic. The people who could lead it, who could manage the coalitions, who could inspire the people, who could keep the middle classes on side, like Raphael. Okay, those people, it removes those from the Republic, and means that the government are run by less able people, people who can't keep the coalitions together, people who can't keep the middle class vote, and people who can't make the democracy work. And this will also hurt democracy. It's been a long one. My voice is giving up anyway. Next week we'll be at the very end of the sections. We'll be at the very end of this first section, which is looking at hyperinflation in 1923. Apart from that, I will see you soon. Have a good night.